Hey guys, welcome back to How to Convince with Lawyer Vince. Today, we're talking about one of the more isolating moments in communication. It's the moment when you're sitting in a room, everyone around you has landed on the same conclusion and you don't agree with it. Maybe it's a work meeting where the team has rallied around a plan you think is a mistake. Maybe it's a family decision where everyone's on the same page except you. Or maybe it's a group of friends who all agreed on something and you're the only person quietly thinking, this doesn't seem right. And in that moment, something happens that has almost nothing to do with the actual merits of your position. The room starts to feel like evidence. Everyone agrees. And so maybe they're right and you're missing something. Maybe your disagreement is the problem rather than the plan. That feeling is powerful enough that most people don't speak up. They do the math without realizing they're doing it. The social cost of being the lone dissenting voice against the cost of staying quiet. And staying quiet almost always wins. So the room moves forward with a false consensus. Everyone thinks everyone agrees, when really one or two people just decided it wasn't worth the friction to say otherwise. Today, we're going to talk about why being outnumbered feels like being wrong, even when it isn't, why staying silent costs more than most people realize, and exactly how to speak up in a way that gets heard instead of dismissed. So let's get into it. Let's start with why being outnumbered feels like being wrong. There's a specific psychological phenomenon worth understanding because it explains why this feels so much harder than it should. It's called social proof, and it's one of the most deeply wired decision making shortcuts humans have. The basic mechanism is quite simple. When we're uncertain about something, we look at what other people believe or are doing and use that as evidence. If everyone around you believes something, your brain treats that agreement as information, almost as though the group's consensus is itself a data point about what's true. This shortcut exists for good evolutionary reasons. For most of human history, going along with the group was a reasonably reliable survival strategy, and breaking from it carried real risk. The wiring that makes disagreement with a group feel uncomfortable isn't a personal flaw. It's an old, deeply embedded mechanism doing exactly what it evolved to do. And it doesn't distinguish between a genuinely dangerous departure from the group and a business meeting where you just see the data differently than everyone else in the room. What this means practically is that the discomfort you feel when you're the only one disagreeing isn't a signal that you're wrong. It's a signal that you're outnumbered and your nervous system is treating those two things as though they're the same. They're not. Group consensus and correctness are frequently correlated, but they're not the same thing. And the gap between them is exactly where some of history's worst decisions have been made, by rooms full of people who all agreed with each other and were all wrong together. There's a second layer to this worth naming, which is what happens to your own confidence in your position the longer you sit in a room where everyone else disagrees with you. Even if you walked in certain, the accumulated social pressure of everyone else's agreement tends to erode that certainty in real time. You start silently reconsidering. You start looking for the flaw in your own thinking that would explain why you're the only one who sees it this way. Sometimes that reconsideration is genuinely useful. Sometimes the room does know something you don't, but often it's not reconsideration at all. It's just social pressure disguising itself as open mindedness, quietly talking you out of a position you actually still believe. There's also something worth understanding about what happens inside groups that reach consensus quickly and comfortably. Groups that agree easily often have actually stress tested the idea. They've just found the path of least resistance where enough people either genuinely agreed or didn't want to be the one who slowed things down. A room that arrives at a conclusion without friction isn't necessarily a room that arrived at the right conclusion. It might just be a room where nobody wanted to be the person who disagreed, which means your disagreement, uncomfortable as it feels, might be the only thing standing between the group and a decision nobody actually pressure tested. Now, let's pivot to why staying silent costs more than it seems to. The math that leads people to stay quiet feels reasonable in the moment. Speaking up risks friction, right? Awkwardness, being wrong in front of everyone, being seen as difficult or a contrarian. Staying quiet avoids all of that. In the short term, silence genuinely is the more comfortable option, right? And that comfort, it's very real. It's not imaginative, right? But the costs of staying silent are just deferred, not avoided, and they tend to be larger than the cost of speaking up would have been. The first cost is to the decision itself. If your disagreement is Substantive. If you're seeing something the group has missed, staying quiet means the group moves forward without that information. Whatever downside your disagreement would have flagged is now unaddressed, and it surfaces later, usually at a worse time and with higher stakes than it would have if it had been raised when you first saw it. The meeting where you stayed quiet becomes the retrospective where everyone asks how nobody caught this, and you're sitting there knowing you did. The second cost is to you specifically, and it compounds over time in a way that's easy to miss until it's already substantial. Every time you stay quiet when you disagreed, you reinforce a pattern, both to yourself and to the people around you. To yourself, you reinforce the belief that your read on situations isn't reliable enough to voice, that the group's judgment should override your own by default. That belief doesn't stay contained to one meeting. It becomes how you generally relate to your own perspective in group settings, and it gets harder to interrupt the longer it runs. To the people around you, your silence reads as agreement, which means your actual thinking, right? The thing that might have been valuable never becomes visible. Over enough repetitions, you become someone whose opinion is rarely heard. Not because you don't have one, but because you've trained the room not to expect it. The third cost. The third cost is more subtle and shows up in how you feel about the decisions you're part of. Being part of a group decision you privately disagreed with and never voiced creates a specific kind of quiet resentment. Not necessarily toward a group, but toward the situation and sometimes toward yourself. You're now you're invested in the outcome of something you didn't actually believe in. Watching it play out. Sometimes watching it go wrong in exactly the way you anticipated, without ever having had the chance to be wrong out loud or right out loud. There's no version of that outcome that feels good. If it goes well, you don't get credit for having doubted it privately. If it goes badly, you carry the knowledge that you saw it coming and said nothing. What's worth understanding is that the discomfort of speaking up is front loaded and finite. It's uncomfortable in the moment and then it's over. The discomfort of staying silent is smaller in any given instance, but distributed across a much longer timeline, showing up as regret, as resentment, as the slow erosion of your own trust and your judgment. The total cost of silence is usually higher. It's just harder to see because it doesn't arrive all at once. Finally, let's talk about what you really came for. How to speak up and how to actually be heard. Disagreeing with a room full of people who've already reached consensus requires a different approach than ordinary disagreement because you're not just making a point, you're interrupting momentum that's already built up, social weight behind it. Doing that effectively requires some specific technique, right? Courage alone is not enough. Remember, you want you want to time it before the consensus fully hardens. The earlier you raise a dissenting view, the easier it is for the group to actually consider it. Once a room is fully settled into agreement, once people have started talking about implementation, once the decision has been treated as made, raising a disagreement requires the group to psychologically undo something, which is a much bigger ask than raising it while the decision is still forming. If you sense the room moving forward, like toward a consensus that you disagree with, the moment to speak up is while it's still moving, not after it's arrived. Waiting until you're certain, right? It feels safer, but it often means waiting until the cost of speaking up has gone up substantially. Another big tip here is to lead with curiosity, right, instead of certainty. Walking into a room of people who agree with each other and immediately asserting that they're wrong, right? That tends to trigger defensiveness before your actual point has a chance to be heard. Right. And it's not because your point is bad, but because you framed it as an attack on a decision people have already invested in. A more effective entry point is a genuine question that opens the room back up rather than closing it down. Say this: can I raise something I don't think we fully considered? Or I want to push on this a little. Can I share where I'm seeing it differently? This framing does something important. It signals that you're contributing to the group's thinking rather than opposing it, which makes it much easier for people to actually engage with what you say next instead of immediately defending the position they've already taken. A huge point I want to make is that you need to be specific, not just contrarian, right? Vague disagreement, right? Saying, I'm just not sure about this. It's easy for a room to dismiss because there's nothing concrete to engage with. Specific disagreement is much harder to wave away. Say, I think the timeline assumes we'll have a vendor approval by the 15th. And based on their last two turnaround times, that seems optimistic. See, that gives the room something real to evaluate rather than a vague unease they can attribute to you being difficult. The more specific your disagreement, the more it reads as substantive analysis rather than personality. And the harder it becomes for the group to dismiss it without actually engaging with the content. I also want to note, never apologize for the disagreement itself. There's a strong instinct to cushion dissent with excessive softening, saying, I might be totally off base here, or this is probably a dumb question, but, right? These qualifiers feel like they're making the disagreement easier for the room to receive, but they actually undermine it before it's been heard. They signal that even you don't take your own position seriously, which gives everyone else permission not to either. You can be warm and respectful in tone without preemptively discrediting your own point. State it like you mean it because you do. Let's also talk about holding your position through the initial pushback, right? The first response to a dissenting voice in a room that's already reached consensus is it's often mild pushback, right? They're not trying to be hostile, usually just a quick explanation of why the group landed where it did, right? Delivered with the implicit expectation that this will resolve your concern. If your concern isn't exactly resolved by the explanation, say so calmly and specifically. Say, I hear that, and I'm still not sure it addresses the timeline issue specifically. Can we look at that piece a little closer? See, caving at the first pushback, even when your concern hasn't actually been addressed, is one of the most common ways dissent gets swallowed. The pushback isn't necessarily a sign you're wrong. Sometimes it's just the room's discomfort with having its momentum interrupted, expressing itself as a quick reassurance rather than as genuine reconsideration. Final point. Final point I want to make is that you need to accept that being heard and being agreed with are different outcomes. Speaking up doesn't guarantee the group changes course, and it's worth separating those two outcomes clearly in your own mind before you speak. Sometimes you raise a genuinely valid point, and the group, for reasons that may or may not be good ones, moves forward anyway. Right? It's not a failure of your delivery. You did your job, which was to make sure the information and the perspective were actually in the room and actually considered. What the group does with it after that is not entirely within your control. And it was never supposed to be. The goal of speaking up isn't to guarantee that you win an argument. It's to make sure that if the decision goes wrong, it doesn't go wrong because something important never got said. So here's what all this comes down to. Being outnumbered feels like being wrong because your nervous system is running an old shortcut, right? Treating group agreement as evidence of truth, even when the two things have nothing to do with each other. That feeling, it's real, but it's not information about whether your position is correct. It's information about how many people currently agree with you, which is a very different thing. The cost of staying silent isn't smaller than the cost of speaking up. It's just deferred, distributed across a longer timeline, and easier to miss until it's already accumulated into something significant, right? A bad decision nobody flagged, a version of yourself that stopped trusting its own read on things, a quiet resentment about outcomes you never got to weigh in on, honestly. Speaking up when you're the only one who disagrees, it's not about being confrontational or contrarian for its own sake. It's about timing it before the consensus hardens, right? Leading with curiosity instead of certainty, being specific instead of vague, and holding your position through the first wave of pushback without folding immediately just because folding is more comfortable. You don't need the room to agree with you in order for speaking up to have been worth it. You just need to make sure that what you saw actually got said. If this resonated with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs it. Comment "speak up" so I know that you made it to the end with me. And if you want to actually practice this, right, not just understand it, but build the muscle for it with real support around you, come join us in the communication gym. We've got an entire community becoming the confident communicators they've always dreamt to be. Join before Thursday. You can be part of our live call that's every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific time. Come be a part of it. Link is in the description. Thank you as always to everyone listening. You are taking the steps and putting in the work, and I can't be more grateful to have you here as part of this community. This has been How to Convince with Larry Vince, and I'll see you at the same time next week.
Say it smart, say it quick. Words that land, words that stick. Now I know what to say. Ever since I followed How to Convince with Lawyer Vince. Lawyer